Hello and welcome back, Biology 182 lab students. Today we'll be discussing Lab 40A, which is on page 439 in your lab text. We'll be talking about phyla Echinodermata and Hemichordata. Your objectives for this lab are list echinoderm and hemichordate characteristics closely associated with successful food gathering and survival. Number 2, describe the morphology of organisms in Echinodermata and Hemichordata. Number 3, list characteristics that echinoderms and hemichordates share with the phyla discussed previously. Number 4, discuss characteristics of echinoderms and hemichordates that are unique or advanced compared to more primitive phyla. Number 5, describe the water vascular system of echinoderms. Number 6, discuss the embryological characteristics that distinguish deuterostomes from protostomes. And number 7, understand which phyla are protostomes and which are deuterostomes. On our first slide here, we can take a look and see we have some sea stars that move via tube feet. Although their arms can bend slowly, it isn't a fast process. In the top right, we see a brittle star, which moves more like a traditional animal that uses legs that we're used to, via something like muscular contractions rather than just tube feet. In the bottom left, we see a sea urchin, which moves via tube feet and uses tube feet also to collect food and sense their surroundings. And in the bottom right is a sea lily, which is like a sea star but live more of a sessile lifestyle. In summary, echinoderms are a group of around 7,000 invertebrate marine bottom dwellers with spiny skin made of calcium carbonate that functions as an endoskeleton. These animals are closely related to the chordates and share with them the developmental trait of deuterostomy, which was conserved throughout the evolution of the last major lineage of animals. Echinoderms are united by their pentaradial symmetry, which means five-sided, a water vascular system for movement, somewhat like hydraulics, and an endoskeleton of bone-like plates called ossicles. They are dioecious, which means there are male and females, and reproduce sexually via external fertilization, although many can regenerate lost limbs, but cannot regenerate an entire individual. If you look up to the top right, echinoderms look simple but are more complex than mollusks, annelids, and arthropods. And in the bottom right, we see a sea star with its tube feet, which are hydraulically operated, and spines. During your study of Chapter 40, the Phylum Echinodermata, which means spiny skin, there are 4 questions I want you to keep in mind. Number 1, how did the special morphological structures found in echinoderms help them survive in their environment? Number 2, how does one differentiate the 5 classes of echinoderms? Number 3, what ancestral characteristics do echinoderms share with the phyla discussed previously? And number 4, describe the water vascular system of echinoderms and what is it used for? And the 5 classes of echinoderms are distinguished primarily by the arrangement of their ossicles, not so much their appearance. The last major lineage of animals, the echinoderms and chordates, we look at the ancestral traits. We can see that both echinoderms and chordates have true tissues. Number 2, bilateral symmetry falls into chordata, but pentaradial symmetry falls into echinoderms. Number 3, they both have organ systems. Number 4, they're coelomates, which means they have a true coelom that's from a digestive tube. Number 5, they're triploblastic, which means they have 3 distinct cell layers in development. And number 6, they have a complete digestive tract. Now there's one new derived trait that's shared with chordates, just being a deuterostome. And we'll discuss what deuterostomes are in the next slide. Let's take a look off to our right. Take a look at our diagram here. Again, let's start at the bottom of our animal kingdom. We have an ancestral, colonial, choanoflagellate. And then we have parazoa. They don't have true tissues, that's the sponges. Eumetozoa that have the true tissues. And then that's split into 2 groups, radiata and bilateria. Radiata has radial symmetry and they're diploblastic, and those are the jellies and comb jellies. And bilateria has 2 groups, acoelomates, which no body cavity like the platyhelminths, and ones that have body cavities, and those are split into 2 groups. The pseudocoelomates, they have a body cavity, but it's not enclosed by a mesoderm, and those are the rotifers and nematodes. And then the true coelomates. Those are ones that have body cavity enclosed by a mesoderm. And then we have protostomes, the leucophorates, and the deuterostomes. And again, to remind you, the dashed line means we're not sure exactly where those phyla fit into this phylogenetic tree. The protostomes, they have a coelom that comes from cell masses, and those are the mollusks, annelids, and arthropods. And then on to our last group, the deuterostomes. They have a coelom from a digestive tube. And those are the echinoderms and chordates. The 2 major lineages of coelomate animals differ in embryonic development. The deuterostomes, the taxonomic term deuterostomia comes from the Greek word second mouth, are a superphylum of animals. Deuterostomes are distinguished by their embryonic development. In deuterostomes, the first opening, the blastopore, becomes the anus, while in protostomes it becomes the mouth. In both deuterostomes and protostomes, a zygote first develops into a hollow ball called the blastula. In deuterostomes, the early divisions occur parallel or perpendicular to the polar axis. This is called radial cleavage, and also occurs in certain protostomes, such as the leucophorates. Most deuterostomes display intermediate cleavage, in which the developmental fate of the cells in the developing embryo are not determined by the identity of the parent cell. Thus, if the first 4 cells are separated, each cell is capable of forming a complete small larva. And if the cell is removed from the blastula, and other cells will compensate. So let's take a look at our diagram. We can see 2 groups, the protostomes, which are the mollusks, annelids, and arthropods. We see deuterostomes, which are the echinoderms and the chordates. And we see to the left our fate of our blastopore. Well, if we take a look at the diagrams, the protostomes, you see the digestive tube, the mouth develops from the blastopore. And then to the right, the deuterostomes is reverse. The anus develops from the blastopore. All right, let's discuss the natural history of Phylum Echinodermata. The habitat, they live on the ocean floor ranging from the intertidal zone to deep sea floors. We find them in the abyssal plains, and sometimes we find them even down in the trenches in the ocean, several miles down. They have a water vascular system. Echinoderms lack gills and a circulatory system. Alternatively, they use a water vascular system. Echinoderms, the coelom forms the water vascular system as a series of canals through the body which are filled with fluid and distribute dissolved gases, minerals, and sugars throughout the otherwise unvascularized bodies. This system functions secondarily in locomotion. The system comprises a central ring called the hydrocele and radial ambularca stretching along the body or arms. As well as assisting the distribution of nutrients through the animal, the system is most obviously expressed in the tube feet of most echinoderms. Tube feet are extensions of the water vascular system on which poke through small holes in the skeleton and can be extended or contracted by the redistribution of fluid between the foot and the internal sac. Alright, let's discuss this for a moment. This is a hydraulic system using water to contract a foot with typically a sucker on the end. Examples: in the crinoids, the tube feet waft food particles captured on the radial limbs toward the central mouth. In the asteroids, or sea stars, the same wafting motion is employed to move the animal across the ground. Sea urchins use their feet to prevent the larvae of encrusting organisms from settling on their surfaces. Potential settlers are often moved into the urchin's mouth and eaten. Some burrowing sea stars poke their tube feet through the surface of the sand or mud above them into the water column and use them to attain oxygen from the water column. So they arose around 540 million years ago in the Cambrian period. We spoke that they are marine bottom dwellers. We talked about an endoskeleton, and they can autotomize limbs, which means you can cut off a sea star's partial of their foot or arm, and they'll grow it back. They're pentaradial symmetry, but keep in mind the larvae are bilateral, which is shared with that in chordates. And we talked about the water vascular system, coelom, that forms a series of water-filled canals that transports gases and nutrients, and movement by muscles of contracting against hydrostatic pressure. So, our muscles in vertebrates move against bones to move lever systems. Well, since they don't have the same type of lever systems, they will fill their hydrostatic system with enough pressure to make sacs very hard, like filling a leather balloon with an incredible amount of pressure, and it becomes a very hard thing, somewhat like a football, but filled with water. And of course we talked about tube feet, which are used in locomotion and filter feeding. Now let's take a look at some classes in Echinodermata. We have the Asteroidea, which is the sea stars. We don't call them starfish because they are not fish. They are active predators. So that means they will move around their environment searching for their prey. And they typically eat bivalves, such as clams, gastropods, such as snails and slugs, and corals. They have 5 stout arms lined with short spines, but some of the asteroideans have more than 5 arms. And not used in locomotion typically. The tube feet are the main movers of the organism. Those are adapted for slow movement and predation. And for smelling, they also have chemoreceptors on their tube feet. They can sense chemicals around their environment. And you can imagine with that many sensors of smell, they can hone in very well on their prey. They have dermal gills, gills that extend off the skin and aid in gas exchange. They have pedicellariae, which are microscopic jaws surrounding the spines. And those aid in defense, especially at small organisms that would try to make their home on them. And ambulacral grooves, which is an opening along the bottom of the arms for the tube feet to emerge. So we can take a look at our bottom left picture. And there's the pedicellariae. We can see that there's the expanded view of a single jaw, and you put 2 together and they make kind of like a mandible and a jaw. And there's a video on dermal gills below that. Be sure to take a look at that. And if you take a look at our bottom right picture, we can see a sea star that's opening a clam to eat the meat inside. And it takes quite a bit of time, but how they work is all they have to do is open a small portion of the clam, and then they have a stomach that comes out their mouth. It's everted and goes in to the inside of the shells and digests the clam inside of its own shell. Further talking about class Asteroidea, the sea stars, or starry ones. If we take a look at their anatomy, we can see at the top left that stomach that's everted, as I mentioned in the last slide. Of course, they keep the stomach inside of their bodies, but only to digest. And then we can also see tube feet in that same picture that are being protruded out of the ambulacra. In the top right picture, we see A star with more than 5 arms, even with more than 10 legs, the central disk is pentaradial symmetric. So a sun star can have many, even dozens of arms, but yet the mouthpiece is still pentaradial. In the bottom left, we can see the ambulacral grooves and those stout spines that come from those ossicles. And then the bottom right, you see a great sea star, and water enters the animal through this thing called a madreporite. And that madreporite can open and close depending on the water needs of the animal at the time. Keeping in mind that sea stars vary in number of arms, color, texture. See the top left, we have a sea star that is purple. And whenever I see bright colors, I typically think that that organism is bad tasting or poisonous in some way to a predator. In the middle top, we see a Bahama star, which is brightly colored orange. But keep in mind, the colors that we see, such as purple or orange, is in very shallow water, and many of these organisms do not live in shallow water. They'll live in deeper water, and, of course, seawater filters many wavelengths of light, blue being the most powerful and can penetrate the deepest. So, you can imagine that the orange in that top middle perhaps is not what a predator would see several meters down in the water column. In the top right, we see a sea star that has lost one of its limbs and is currently regenerating it. And then the bottom left, we see a girl standing next to a very large sea star. Some of these sea stars can be more than a meter across and are apex predators in an intertidal zone. In the bottom right, we see an armed sea star that has 11 arms. But always the same mouth parts are pentaradial. Keep that in mind. And the last note, there's about 1,800 of species of sea stars that are known. Taking a further look at the internal anatomy of Asteroidea, this will prep you for your dissection. What I'm going to do is start on the tips of the arms and work my way in. At the bottom, we can see a label of tube feet. And you can see the tube feet run in columns or rows all the way to the tip of the arm. Now the tube feet are only a little bit of that hydraulic system. Looking at that bottom right diagram, we can see the tube feet are connected to ampulla, and there are many nerves, like the radial nerve, that control the tube feet's locomotion. Now, how water flows is through this pore called the madreporite, we can see in the top right, and that is transported to the ring canal, and then the ring canal transports water to the radial canal, which goes to the ampulla and then into the tube feet. But the ampulla are surrounded by muscles, so you can see in the bottom left, that contract and squeeze water into the tube feet, thus giving locomotion. In the right arm, we can see gonads extend into an arm. Arms are fairly voluminous, so organs fit inside there, and they're not just around the central disc. In the top right, we can see that madreporite. And along the epidermis, we can see spines and dermal gills. And those are the microscopic gills that allow for respiration. If we look to the left bottom arm, we can see the digestive glands that secrete digestive enzymes into the stomach, which can be everted. Now, going to the center of the sea star, we can see the stomach and the anus. And the anus will poke out the top, and the mouth is on the bottom. It's a little backwards from what we're used to in the chordate world. The second class we'll be discussing in Echinodermata are the Ophiuroideans, or brittle stars, which means snake-like ones. They move in a different way than the Asteroideans. The brittle stars use their arms, much as we use our arms and legs to move around our habitat. In the top left picture we can see they have very flexible arms. They're not static, or somewhat static, like the Asteroideans. In the bottom left picture we can see that they have closed ambulacral grooves. That's because they don't rely on their tube feet as much for locomotion. There's a video you can check out on a crawling brittle star, which they crawl, they don't cruise. That's how I differentiate the two. Asteroideans cruise, whereas the brittle stars crawl. In the top right picture we can see they have very slender spines surrounding their arms. That is typically used for protection and locomotion. You want some traction on those arms as they move around in sandy habitats. In the bottom right picture we can see their very slender arms compared to the Asteroideans. One thing to note about the brittle stars is they are predators. They not only use their arms for locomotion, but also to capture prey and food items and put it into their mouth. Whereas an Asteroidean would go to a clam and open up its shells carefully and extrude their stomach, whereas the brittle stars are able to feed themselves, somewhat like we do. The Ophiuroideans, again the brittle stars, or sometimes referred to as the serpent stars, have a somewhat similar lifestyle as the Asteroideans. However, we find more diversity in their arms. Many live in deep waters, so most of them are around 1,600 feet below sea level, or 1,600 feet deep in the ocean. Some of them are predators, some of them are filter feeders, and some of them scavenge dead organic matter. And here is where the tube feet come into play for filter feeders. They use them to collect particles in the water. Most are nocturnal, and one would find them under rocks during the day. Again, they have slender snake-like arms that are very flexible for quick movement, and stacked ossicles. They have closed ambulacral grooves, so they have no opening under their arms for tube feet. Instead, the tube feet project out of pores all over their arms. And we see those tube feet emerge between ossicles, and with the Asteroideans, they sense light and odors, and they can capture food particles because they're coated with mucus. In the top right picture, we see two different species of Ophiuroideans. You can see one that doesn't have many projections coming out of its arm, that's very smooth and tan and black. And then the bottom one has many projections coming out of its arms, typically for filter feeding. And then in the bottom picture we can see one with very long tube feet projecting from its arms to collect food within the water. If you'd like to see one in the aquarium on the second floor of the biology building, we do have a few brittle stars. The best time to see them is early in the morning or late at night. The third class within Echinodermata we'll be discussing are the crinoids, or Crinoidea, which are the sea lilies and feather stars, and Crinoidea means in Latin the lily-like ones. Feather stars are mobile. They can swim within the water column. So the sea stars and serpent stars are more of a bottom-dwelling class. The crinoids can move around. However, sea lilies are sessile. We find an abundance of sea lilies, or crinoids, in the fossil record because the stalk is hard-bodied amongst many of the other parts and fossilize well within sandy embankments that cover them. There's a few videos of swimming feather stars. It's a beautiful video. One thing to note with feather stars, they're much like sea jellies in that they can control the z-axis locomotion up and down in the water column, but not much to the left and right and the forward and back. They rely on currents in the ocean to take them along those axes. Further looking at class Crinoidea, we've noted that they are the most ancient of all echinoderms. They arose somewhere around 540 million years ago. They typically live from shallow to deep water, and as we mentioned, sea lilies can move around those habitats. Up to 6,000 meters down, we can find them in the abyssal plains and into the deepest trenches, such as the Mariana Trench. They have a mouth and an anus, but both of them are on top, and they have a U-shaped gut. So you can imagine if you have both your mouth and your anus on top, then the gut will be U-shaped. Why is that adaptive? These echinoderms spend most of their time resting on a substrate. If they excreted waste at the end of their stalks, then they would be forming a little pile of excrement beneath themselves. Thus, they have evolved a U-shaped gut, which allows excretion of waste between their arms and the arboreal surface. What this is for is they use their feather-like arms to wave a current and blast their excretion into the water column. They are filter feeders, so they take particulates in the water and they trap them with their tiny tube feet and their arms. And then the arms are licked clean by the mouth. So the mouth is very delicate, and the arms and the tube feet fit quite nicely in it, and then the arm can move and slide the tube feet through the mouth, thus collecting the food. They have stacked ossicles, which form the arms and the stalk, and then those arms are divided into pinnules. These are pinnate branches, much like feathers, that trap the food particles. How the food particles get trapped are much like the brittle stars. Those tube feet and pinnules are coated in mucus, which makes them sticky. If we look at the top right picture, we can see two distinct parts called the crown and the stalk is held to the substrate via a holdfast, much like kelp. And then we can see the columnal, and then we can see a boral cup, the arms, and a pinnule, and then the mouth is in the center along with the anus. In the bottom right picture, we can see a close-up picture of the pinnules, and again, those are covered in mucus to trap food. Taking a look at crinoid anatomy, we can compare sea lilies and feather stars. Take a look to the right. They both have a crown. However, the crown for the feather star is used for filter feeding and swimming, whereas the sea lily, it's mostly for filter feeding. They both have a calyx, they both have arms with pinnules, but the sea lily has a distinct stalk, whereas the feather star does not. And then on the bottom of the feather star, there are appendages called cirri, which are legs for perching on rocks. And those arms, for both of them, branch from 5 main joints. If we take a look at our bottom left diagram, you can see those 5 main joints. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, coming from those arms, we see the pinnules at the top there. Moving to the right, we can see there are 2 distinct plates, deltoid plates and small peripheral plates. And keep in mind that those plates do move to control the arms and control the mouth. which we can see the mouth is in the center, and then the anal cone is in the side, the periphery to the mouth. And then we can see the ambulacral grooves, as we saw in the Asteroideans. Do they have pantoradial symmetry? By looking at the central disc. Of course they do. It's evident there. And keep in mind that the anus and the mouth are on the boral surface, but they are not so close together that it would be feeding on its own excretion. And keep in mind there's always a temporal displacement between time to excrete and time to feed. So when it's excreting, it has a completely different rhythmic motion of its arms to propel the excretion away. And then when it's eating, it's pulling in food into the mouth. The fourth class we'll be discussing within Echinodermata is the Echinoideans, which are the sea urchins and sand dollars. Also referred to as the hedgehogs of the sea, because they resemble a hedgehog. In the top left picture, we see a sand dollar with that flower-like structure in the center, referring to a pentaradial symmetry. There's a video below that, and the sea urchin moving with spines and tube feet. In the bottom left picture, we can see the anus is on top, and the madreporite next to it. Madreporite suggests that they operate in a hydraulic system, much like the Asteroideans. And again, they have tube feet that move them around, rather than the serpent stars moving around with arms. Top right picture, we see another sand dollar that's less flat and more round. And the bottom right, we see another sea urchin. Those long filamental processes coming out of its body are the tube feet, used for collecting food as they cruise around in their bottom habitat of the sea. Further looking at class Echinoidea, the sand dollars and sea urchins again, obviously see that they're different than the Asteroideans, the serpent stars, and the crinoids because they lack arms. They're typically round or flat and round. They have a dome-like structure that's called a test, and that's made by the fusion of ossicles. And then the movement of the animal is much like the Asteroideans, where they have tube feet. And tube feet protrude through holes in the test in very specific arrangements. We can see pictures of those off to the top right and the bottom left. They have jointed spines, so the spines actually do move, and it's used for righting itself if they're overturned, or to protect against predators. They can direct those spines. And, of course, they have teeth. There are 5 ossified plates. They come from an organ called the Aristotle's lantern, which is the bottom right picture. And they use those teeth to scrape off algae or eat prey. The Aristotle's lantern is a collection of bone-like structures, or calcium carbonate structures, many muscles, and a hydraulic system that all work in synchrony to move the teeth in such a way that it allows the animal to scrape off food or capture prey. The 2 middle pictures at the bottom, we have a sand dollar at the top, and then the bottom picture is of a sea urchin that has been despined. You may find these on the beach, typically without their spines, because their spines at the joints are soft tissue and degrade quicker than the hard tissue. Looking at the sea urchin test, we can see, of course, the ossicles are fused into a sphere with holes, and those pores are where the protruding tube feet come from. We can see they have an aboral surface, which means ab-oral, or lacking the mouth, which is where the anus is, and they have a madreporite at the top. And then at the bottom we can see they have the oral surface. We can see those tube feet coming out in those very specific rows and columns, and then spines also arranged in very particular rows and columns, and they're intermixed. Of course, we have many spines and many tube feet. The spines can break off quite easily, but are regenerated quickly. Sea urchins, mostly being herbivores, feed on kelp. There are many organisms that eat sea urchins. Sea otters, other sea mammals like seals and sea lions. There are many sea stars big asteroideans that feed on sea urchins, like the sunstar. But if those top predators are removed, say otters are killed for their fur and fish are harvested for their meat, then the kelp forest can be out of balance. Take a look at the bottom left picture. We see a kelp forest that's intact. And just by looking at the number of fish, we can see there's quite a bit of biodiversity there. But in the bottom right picture, we can see there is no kelp and many, many sea urchins. And any time a kelp tries to sprout, a sea urchin will attack it and eat it. So, keeping an ecosystem in balance requires the apex predators to continue doing their job and keeping many of the herbivores in check. There's a video down at the bottom right on the trophic balance that's disturbed. I encourage you to check it out. The last class in Echinodermata we'll be discussing is class Holothuroidea, or the sea cucumbers. Call these the whole ones. Just glancing at the pictures, we can automatically see they don't have arms like the Asteroideans or serpent stars. How do they feed? They're generally scavengers feeding on debris in the benthic zone of the ocean. The diet consists of plankton, decaying organic matter, and sometimes they'll filter feed. They position themselves in currents and catch food that flows by with their open tentacles. They often sift through the bottom sediments using their tentacles. Other species can dig into the bottom silt or sand until they are completely buried. Then they extrude their feeding tentacles, ready to withdraw at any hint of danger. Defense. Some defend themselves by expelling their sticky Cuvarian tubules, in the bottom left picture, enlargements of the respiratory tree that float freely in the coelom, to entangle potential predators. When startled, the sea cucumbers may expel them through a tear in the wall of the cloaca in an autotomic process known as evisceration. Replacement tubules grow back in 1.5 to 5 weeks, depending on the species. They have defense toxins. The release of these tubules can also be accompanied by discharge of a toxic chemical known as holothurin, which has similar properties to soap. The chemicals can kill any animal in the vicinity, is one more way in which these sedentary animals can defend themselves. Sometimes we'll find them in herds we call cucumber herds. They can be found in great numbers in the deep sea floor, where they often make up the majority of the animal biomass. At depths deeper than 5.5 miles, or 8.8 kilometers, sea cucumbers comprise 90% of the total mass of microfauna and macrofauna. Sea cucumbers form large herds that move across the bathygraphic features of the ocean hunting food. In more shallow water, sea cucumbers can form dense populations. The strawberry sea cucumber of New Zealand lives on rocky walls around the northern and the southern coast of the South Island, where populations sometimes reach densities of 1,000 animals per square meter. For this reason, one such area in the Fiordland is simply called the Strawberry Fields. We take a look at our pictures here. In the top left, we can see those tube feet that are modified for filter feeding, and also in the top middle picture, in the top right, we can see some species of sea cucumber are very large and can be used for human consumption. In the bottom left picture, we can see those sticky tubules coming out of the organism. In the bottom right, the biggest point about the Holothuroideans is they don't have any arms, and they don't necessarily have that star shape to what we're used to. But they are pentaradial on the inside. There are several videos I'd like you to check out. There's feeding with branched tube feet video, the video on the sticky tubules, and at the bottom right, the often sessile but crawl on the tube feet, much like the Asteroideans. I just ate a bunch of pizza, and I want you guys to know I cut my pizza into 5 very big slices, and I made myself an arboreal surface to remind myself of what we're studying. I just thought you should know that. The Holothuroideans, we can see, are clearly different. First of all, they're soft-bodied. They don't have the same type of ossicle structures we find in Asteroideans or serpent stars. They have a lot of collagen. And collagen is interesting because it's densely packed but can be disconnected at will. What this allows is extension or distension of the animal to fit in very small places, like rock crevices. They don't have very many spines. Most are spineless, but occasionally you'll find a species that is partially or fully covered in spines, such as the top right picture and the bottom right picture. They have feeding tentacles. In the top right picture we can see that starry blue structure coming out from the animal. Those are covered in mucus to trap plankton and detritus, and the food is scraped off by the arms into the mouth, so it's licked clean. They have pentaradial symmetry, but that's because it's less obvious to you guys because the body axis is oriented horizontally. And their defense, we talked about the sticky tubules that come from the cloaca and those entangle predators, and they have a lethal chemical discharge. Another defense that Holothuroideans have is to expel a huge amount of their intestine. Their intestine will come out the anus, and a predator will choose to eat that rather than the organism, and the sea cucumber will slowly crawl away using its tube feet. You'll have to forgive any grumbling noises coming from the background. That would be Mr. Pippins, that is barking or guffing at a dog that is outside the window. For those of you who don't know, guffing sounds like boof. Further looking at sea cucumber anatomy, we see the same structures we find in the rest of the classes of Echinodermata. Taking a look at the left diagram, at the top we see the mouth, and around the mouth we find modified 2 feet that are tentacles, and then at the base of that we find the ring canal. Again, these are hydraulically operated, much like the Asteroideans. They have a calcareous ring. We can see the gonads there. We have a very long sinus intestine, and we have something called a respiratory tree. The respiratory tree extracts oxygen from the water in a pair of trees that branch off the cloaca just inside the anus, so that they breathe by drawing in water through the anus and then expelling it. The trees consist of a series of narrow tubules branching from a common duct and lie on either side of the digestive tract. Gas exchange occurs across the thin walls of the tubules to and from the fluid of the main body cavity. You can see that we have an anus that is on the, quote, bottom, and, of course, a rectum. And take a look at that intestine. That intestine is very convoluted and sinuous. We can see that the overall shape, if we make the organism upright, is similar to that of a sea urchin or Asteroidean. However, they typically lie on their side. An interesting fact about sea cucumbers is they have a commensal relationship with pearlfish. Some species share their cloaca with something called a pearlfish. Now, if we can remember our 3 symbiotic relationships, one being parasitism, where one organism is benefited and the other one is harmed. One is commensalism, where one organism is benefited and the other organism is neither benefited nor harmed. And the last one is a mutualistic relationship where both organisms benefit. So what are the benefits to the fish? Well, it's a source of food, so the nutrients passing in and out of the anus from the water, and of course a place for protection so that pearlfish can develop into their adult life stage. Many polychaete worms and crabs have also specialized to use cloacal respiratory trees for protection by living inside the sea cucumber. See the bottom left picture is a pearlfish inside the cloaca of a species of sea cucumber, and we see the bottom right picture, a pearlfish emerging from the cloaca of a species that's found off the Pacific waters of Mexico and is commonly referred to as donkey dung. In the bottom, we have a video of the pearlfish entering the sea cucumber cloaca. I encourage you to take a look at that. As a review, we've covered 5 classes within Echinodermata. We have class Asteroidea, which are the sea stars, class Ophiuroidea, which are the brittle stars and serpent stars, class Crinoidea are the sea lilies and feather stars, class Echinoidea, which are the sea urchins and sand dullers, and class Holothuroidea, which are our sea cucumbers. In the top right diagram, we can see an example of each of those from each class.